Biblical Justice A to X. If you're joining us in the live audience, please be sure to close your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Each month, Global Justice is pleased to present Biblical Justice A to X, a video conference that follows a range of justice issues from xenophobia to abortion. We're so pleased this month to be focusing on the topic of human trafficking. I'm Sosma Samuel Burnett, and I serve as chair of this session as well as president of Global Justice. And I'm also pleased to be joined today by our expert panelists, three key people who are not only experts on this topic of human trafficking, but on the topic of justice from a biblical worldview. I'm pleased to first introduce Bridget Brewster and Don Brewster, representing Agape International Mission. Agape is one of the leading anti-human trafficking organizations. They're based out of both Sacramento and Cambodia. Welcome, Don and Bridget.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're also joined by Sandra Morgan. Sandra is the director of the Global Center for Justice for Women in Justice at Vanguard University. They work on a range of justice issues, both domestically and internationally, particularly on the topic of human trafficking. Sandra, welcome to the broadcast.
Good to be here.
Well, we're going to be covering a wide range of topics as it relates to the issue of human trafficking, so let's just dive right in. But before we do, I'd like to have each of you take a moment to share a little bit about your organizations and your reference point for this topic. So Don and Bridget, maybe you could lead us off to share a little bit about your work at Agape International Mission.
Go ahead, Bridget.
Well, we're really honored to be working in Cambodia, where our focus is on prevention, rescue, restoration, and reintegration of girls who have been subject to this terror. And we're just honored to see miracles happen every day, and we see how zealous God is about this to be taken care of. If we will step out of our comfort zone and do something, it may seem very small to us, but it can be life-changing for the victim and survivor.
Great. A holistic approach, it sounds like. And then, Dawn, would you add anything to that as far as what you're working on there at Agape?
Yeah, we're also just started getting involved in all cross-border trafficking, so labor trafficking, children as beggars, organ trafficking, and we've gotten a little bit of experience in each of those areas as well.
Thank you. Those are difficult topics to have to wrestle, but we'll be talking more about all of them momentarily. And then, Sandra, would you also share a little bit about your work over at the Global Center for Women in Justice?
Well, Vanguard University's Global Center for Women in Justice is committed to education, research, advocacy, and collaboration. And we want to advance the status of women. And human trafficking is a particularly egregious form of marginalizing and exploiting women and children, but it also happens to men, and so we want to take a look at all aspects of that.
Great, and maybe we could segue from that, Sandra, to this topic of human trafficking. That term is a term that a lot of people have now heard about. In the past, we didn't hear about it as frequently, but now it is a little bit more transparent and apparent. But we still have some confusion about the term. Would you define that for us, Sandra? Give us a feel for what human trafficking is.
Well, if you can imagine that you have 3 columns, and by legal definition, you have to have something from each column in order to be able to identify it as trafficking. The first column would be an action. Did you recruit somebody? Did you obtain them? Did you provide them for someone else? And how did you do that? The means. Did you use force? Did you kidnap them? Did you use coercion? Did you threaten them? Did you use fraud? Did you tell them it was a job and it wasn't really a job? And then finally, the purpose. Was it for a commercial sex act or was it for labor and service? And that's a pretty technical overview. That would fit a UN protocol or a general U.S. federal. States have different laws. I live in California. Extortion is one of our unique forms of trafficking in persons. We did a conference partnership in Athens, Greece in June, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime was there, and they had a translation of how this is approached globally in 193 countries, and it was pretty inspiring to see how different countries address this. But we were in Greece, and so they talked about it as trafficking in human beings. And so I think the basic is pretty much standard across the board. People are being sold, and we don't sell people.
That's great, Sandra. Thank you. You know, it is helpful to know the technical aspects of it, but it's also helpful to know just the underlying concern, which is human beings. Some people even use the term slavery rather than trafficking to kind of really hit home what this issue is really all about. Don and Bridget, lay out this issue for us. Sandra's given us a really great definition, but tell the audience a little bit about what we should really be knowing about this issue of human trafficking. What is human trafficking for us?
I agree with what you said about slavery, right? The fact that it is modern day slavery. And what we can't express in a definition, or what we can't express even with numbers, and the numbers are overwhelming, is what it does to individual life. And that's the part that becomes so, it's difficult to get your head around and really understand the sense of urgency there is, right? And that's one of the things I think that as we discuss human trafficking and slavery, that idea of what is happening in an individual life and the sense of urgency we need in responding to the entire issue.
Thank you. And Bridget, anything you'd like to add to that?
I was really impressed by when I first met Sharon Cohen-Wu from IJM. She simply put it as a sale of a person for the profit and pleasure of another against their will. And just so basic as that is, it just really hit me in my gut, and it makes it very plain just exactly what it is.
Well, and given what you've all described as our sort of definition and the facts around this, we also want to look into a little further the biblical context. You know, each of you come from a biblical perspective in terms of your anti-trafficking work. Maybe I can start off with you, Don. Why is this topic a biblical justice concern? It may seem obvious, but maybe not so obvious to some.
I think in some ways it is obvious, right? Biblical justice is basically standing with the oppressed and fighting injustice. I think what happens sometimes is, for us as Christians, we begin to look at it as a call. Right? We're responding to a call, but in fact, biblical justice is a command, and that each of us as followers of Christ have a responsibility to step up. Now, there is a call within the command, which varies person to person, but the Bible just lays it out so well for us, right? It covers everything from our attitude, right, to the actions we should take, to the expectations that we can have when we do stand with the oppressed and fight injustice. And truly the judgment that will come upon those who say we are followers of Christ and don't respond to that, standing with the oppressed and fighting injustice.
Sandra, I'd like to get your perspective too. Why is this topic a biblical justice topic, as Don has described?
Well, I love Proverbs 31:8 because it isn't someone's call. It is a mandate for all of us to be a voice for those who have no voice and to ensure justice for those being crushed. And I love the New Living Translation, the way it describes that, because that isn't the kind of justice where we're going to go out and arrest the bad guys and throw them in prison. That's the kind of justice that intervenes for someone when things are not right. They're marginalized, they have no resources. When you ensure justice, you step in before they've been completely crushed. You step in and intervene and provide education for girls and children, provide resources for single moms, for widows. Every circumstance is different, but anybody can do something. And it isn't, well, I'm glad that Sandy Morgan over at Global Center is doing something, because then I don't have to. Everybody has to do something. It's a man.
Great. And Bridget, would you like to add to that discussion? And why is this a biblical justice topic?
Well, Christ calls us to be salt and light. And if we're just being salt and light, maybe in our own community, and not exposing it to the rest of the world, to outside our social standing, because it happens to every culture, every race, every creed. It's not just girls here in Cambodia, it's worldwide. It's in every community throughout the world. Maybe Antarctica is the only place that is free from this. But we are called to stand with the oppressed. And a good example is a Good Samaritan who crossed those boundaries of culture and religion to help somebody. And that's what we're supposed to do, to really expose it and to be a help, and to, like Sandra said, before anything happens, to try to be there to cut it off.
Great, thank you. You know, one of the challenges is this is such a troubling topic, and I appreciate what all of you shared about, you know, there are things that people can do, that this is a, you know, a mandate, that this is a requirement for us to act. But sometimes it can be overwhelming. This is a topic that's huge. It's one of the largest growing crimes in the world. It's said to soon overtake even things like drug trafficking because of just how quickly it's expanding. And of course, the numbers are all estimates, so it could be significantly larger. So how does a single person just handle that overwhelming set of statistics? How do we address that? Sandra, you mentioned several different things that we could do, but could you expand on that a little bit? How does someone advocate on behalf of those that are trafficked?
Well, I think that a person has to understand what it looks like in their community, in their country, and know how to call and report it. If you're in the United States, we have the 888-37-37-888 number, and if something doesn't look right, you can call. And about 25% of calls end up rescuing someone. So, yeah, it's okay if you make a mistake and it isn't, but if you don't make that call, it might be someone who isn't found. At the same time, there are everyday choices that we make, and one of my favorite apps on my phone is called Sweat and Toil, and our Department of Labor created an app that you can use to teach your children about our social responsibility. You can look up and say, oh, these bananas, they come from Chile. I look it up on my app. It says children are being used for forced labor. So guess what, kids? We're not buying bananas today. And I'm going to tell the produce guy that. So we start making choices and being a voice, literally, for people. And those are small things that begin to build momentum. The next thing is to become part of the army of people from whatever your discipline is, and learn how to fight it, whether you're victim services, law enforcement, business people, healthcare providers.
That's great, Sandra. Thank you. Now, Don and Bridget, you are working in Cambodia addressing this issue from different angles. Tell us a little bit about how you apply these biblical justice principles in the work that you're doing at Agape International Mission.
Well, one part of our ministry that I really love and appreciate is the Lord's Gym. That is a reach out to punks in the community who were drug runners or traffickers, troublemakers, and they come into the gym and they learn about the precepts of Christ and what God says about how we're to protect and revere children and women. And these men start devotions before they work out. So we have 24 former traffickers who are now kickboxers in our gym. They're on TV every other weekend boxing, and they've made a great difference in their community, looking out, protecting children, protecting women. We see them now coming to church, worshiping the Lord with their children, and just see that transformation of being a perpetrator to a protector is just very exciting for us to see.
That's very powerful. And it's interesting because from a biblical perspective, we need to be concerned not just about the victim and the survivor, but also that perpetrator, that their souls matter also. So it's a very complicated issue when we think about it from that biblical perspective. Don, anything you'd like to add from that biblical perspective in the work that you're doing there?
I would just add that when we take a look at the whole issue, in other words, the prevent, rescue, restoration, reintegration, that we can get so tied up in the idea of, well, we need quality education, we need economic development, we need a justice system, right, that will free the slaves and convict the perpetrators. But that's not enough. It's the heart transformation that comes through Jesus Christ that in the end will make the difference. Those are all good things. But the truth is we have those things in the West in most places, and they haven't done anything on their own to stop human trafficking.
Thank you. Now, all three of you work both domestically and internationally on this issue of human trafficking, and so I'd like to give our audience a sense of that broader picture. Sandra, you mentioned, our own communities. A lot of people may not realize that human trafficking happens almost everywhere and literally in people's backyards. And so, could you frame for us a little bit this domestic understanding of human trafficking?
Well, I live in Orange County, California. And in Orange County, California, we've served, recently we checked our stats, over 700 victims of human trafficking. And that's shocking because we're in a very affluent community and it seems like we shouldn't have those kind of problems. Many of those cases have been domestic servitude, labor trafficking. Sometimes the perpetrators are arrested, sometimes they're not, but we still serve the victims. We still take care of the survivors. A significant amount of the human trafficking right here in Orange County has been commercial sexual exploitation. About a third of those are children under the age of 18. And so our district attorney's office has close to 200 convictions now of traffickers. And that speaks to a community that has grown its awareness, that understands what this issue is. That involves training judges, training law enforcement, victim services, educators in our school system to be able to identify victims. And the comprehensive approach of our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force has created a community where when they've interviewed pimps, they tell us that they don't want to get caught in Orange County because they'll go to jail. So they may be doing remote business or they just don't come to Orange County.
Well, that's great news in terms of the progress there in Orange County. And I know to a large extent your work there at the Global Center for Women and Justice has helped come alongside law enforcement and other entities in that community to make that possible. And their model's similar in places like Sacramento. Here in Denver, we know that it's a very transient area where people are trafficked through this area that has a lot of commerce, a lot of traffic, literally, whether it's train traffic, whether it's trucks, etc., and all of that bring with it the higher risk of trafficking in some of these other communities as well. Agape International Mission is based domestically out of Sacramento. Don, would you speak a little bit about what you're seeing in that Sacramento area, just to give a sense of the local community concerns, domestic concerns on this topic?
In Sacramento, I think I was going to start with a problem. Let me start with some good stuff. There is a good coordination between the law enforcement agencies, and there's a good job that's being done in rescue, and the conviction rate among the perpetrators is good. It gets one of the drawbacks for us in the Sacramento area is aftercare, and providing high quality aftercare for the girls who are rescued and giving them an opportunity to go for that new life that Christ promises us. So there's some really good things happening, but there's also the pretty significant need that still needs to be addressed in the Sacramento area.
Mm. Now that gives us just a little bit of understanding of some of these communities that you're all working directly in, but let's also expand our conversation to this international community. Human trafficking is occurring in almost every region of our world. Sandra, maybe I can start with you and then have Bridget join in terms of what's happening in Cambodia specifically, but give us a little sense of what this issue means globally.
Well, we've hosted several State Department fellows here, most recently from South Sudan, and because of war and conflict and the refugee status, many young people become victims of human trafficking. And I took my class to Athens, Greece, where the refugee crisis because of the Syrian conflict is just huge. And as we did training with refugees, they would raise their hand and say, that's what happened to me. People offer someone who has nothing, someone who has no prospects, and they say, I can get you a job. And if you're desperate and you have nothing to risk, you try it, and they become victims of human trafficking. They're labor trafficked and sex trafficked. So the refugee crisis is like pouring gasoline on a burning fire.
Well, and I think you highlight a very important issue, the refugee crisis being one of them, but vulnerable populations around the globe, you know, issues of poverty, issues of discrimination or disparity, all of those lend to a higher risk. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the myths is that this happens mostly to little girls, but adults are also victims, adult women. Boys are victims right here in the United States. The research is kind of showing us about 15 to 16% are boys that are being trafficked for commercial sex. So I think we have to get rid of our preconceived ideas. One of the big cases that happened here this spring was Asian women being trafficked for sex in Minnesota, and they found the traffickers, the perpetrators, in Irvine, which is here in Orange County, and it was two women who lived in a house with a white picket fence. So the perpetrators, the ones profiting from selling these women, were other women. We need to understand that it's not like Hollywood.
I think that's a very good point, Sandra, that, you know, if we look to our stereotypes of this topic, we may not get to the source or may not be able to solve and address this topic. And I think that's very important that we understand it comes in all sorts of different packages and different circles within our society. Bridget, I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit about Cambodia. Cambodia is an example of a country with some very unique characteristics that has been particularly hit by this issue of sexual slavery, but also human trafficking more broadly. Would you talk a little bit about what's happening there and how that might be indicative of what's going on internationally?
Well, it became kind of a perfect storm for trafficking to happen so easily here after the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnam-American War, and then the Civil War that followed after the Khmer Rouge era that just destroyed all pillars of society. There was so much lost here, and there was no moral compass that made it just a breeding ground for the sale of children. A lot of it's poverty, a lot of it people being tricked into it, but a lot of it there's just that lack of a moral compass that doesn't recognize it's so wrong to sell a child. And we still see here people coming from all over the world to purchase a child or purchase a boy. And it's getting better with education, and we have our own rescue SWAT team that we are more aware of the problem and trying to help make it stop before there's a virgin sale. But it's still, the business evolves, it gets more clever. With the use of the internet, things seem to be moving more that way instead of right on the street where you see it. So it's always trying to keep one step ahead and be as educated as you can as possible about the problem. And there's just so many good books. If you Google under sex trafficking, there's a lot of great books that we read to keep ourselves informed of how things keep evolving.
Mm-hmm. Don, oh yes, Sandra, please go ahead.
Who are the purchasers in Cambodia? Who creates the demand?
It's men from all over. They come from China, South Korea, Japan, America, Australia, Europe. It's just men.
I would chime in that it's Cambodian men is the primary. When you take a look at it overall, when you take a look at the younger girls or boys that are involved, more of a pedophilia type deal, then it's more foreigners involved, including the people from the West.
And you mentioned this idea of sexual slavery on many levels. There is sort of a societal level about whether society values or values, whether it's the girl child, whether it's women in general, and how that might have an impact on human trafficking and sexual slavery. But there's also this external piece that you mentioned, for example, pedophilia being a form of that. Sometimes we use the term sexual tourism. I really don't like that term, but that is a term that's used to reference to that type of activity. I would like to make sure that we are hitting home with our audience what we're dealing with here. Obviously, I don't want you to necessarily have to share, graphic details, but let people know what we are dealing with when we're dealing with this issue of sexual slavery. Don, would you want to start us off with that?
Sure. I think a simple story about a girl that we rescued after 22 days. We were excited. 22 days is pretty short, right? She's a 13-year-old girl. She was a virgin sale, and afterwards her mother sold her into a brothel. She was there 22 days, and in 22 days she was raped by 198 different men. And it's just beyond our imagination how a child suffers that. And sadly, she's not an exception, right? She's not an exception to the rule. She's more of the rule that's happening around the globe, not just in Cambodia. The depth of depravity and the depth of trauma, again, is beyond most of our imaginations.
Well, and it is truly shocking, and no matter how many times someone might hear those statistics, it's just overwhelming to hear them. I do appreciate all of you sharing this idea of the moral compass, of understanding it's more than just circumstance. I'm a mother of 3. If I was falling on very, very difficult economics, I don't think I would sell my children. I think the point that allows you to sell your child is something beyond economics. But there also are economic arguments for why this happens as well. Sandra, I also want to expand out from sexual slavery. You mentioned, that men and boys and many others are also trafficked, and there's various forms of human trafficking, various forms of slavery, bonded labor, other types of forced servitude. Could you talk a little about these other forms so people can understand this idea of human trafficking in a more broad way?
Well, labor trafficking happens globally and is the largest form of modern-day slavery, and it happens on cocoa plantations and cotton plantations. It happens in sweatshops, workshops. It happens here in the United States. So don't be fooled. Because something says made in the USA doesn't mean it wasn't made with slavery. 98 workers in a sweatshop rescued making clothes right here in Southern California. Young men trafficked to work in car washes, working in restaurants, in hotels, those kinds of things. And one of the reasons we hear a lot more about sex trafficking, partly it seems more egregious. But slavery of any form is not biblical. It takes away the dignity of someone created in God's image. But when someone is washing dishes and they're a slave, washing dishes isn't against the law. So it's hard to tell. Selling a child for sex is against the law. So then we have a case that we can prosecute, we can get a conviction. So it's a lot more intensive, labor intensive for law enforcement and our community in order to identify labor trafficking. So then we have to start looking at our moral compass. I'm so glad you used that term, Bridget, because it's our desire to have cheap goods and services that drives demand for modern day slavery. And it's basically the people who sell are greedy and we are greedy. And so we have to examine our own hearts and explore how we can be part of reducing demand.
Sandra, thank you. I think that's a wonderful call to action and a really difficult but important reminder that we're all part of the problem, but we're also part of that solution. And I really appreciate this dialogue that we've had. We only have a few more minutes before we have to close our broadcast, so I want to actually ask each of you to share a little bit about the work that you're currently doing. If there's a highlight or a program that you'd like to make sure that we're aware of, especially addressing this issue. I'll start with you, Don and Bridget, in terms of the work that you're doing there at Agape International Mission.
Well, for me, recently we had a reintegration party celebrating. We have over 500 girls that have been reintegrated back into their communities. So we had a celebration that 124 girls were able to come and attend, and about 20 of them brought their husbands and their children. And some of them hadn't seen each other for 7 years. And to see how they progressed and the joy, and it was just a miracle in real time, just to see how well God has restored them and how well they're prospering and they're back into their communities, where at one time they thought they had no future like that for them.
Thank you for sharing that. Don, anything you'd like to add in terms of the work you're doing there at Agape International Mission?
Well, just one of the new programs that we've started as well is fighting the effects of pornography. In the little village where we live, the Swipak, it's an epidemic. And it's an epidemic that's impacting children as young as 5 and 6 years old. And of course, it helps to fuel, globally, pornography helps to fuel sex trafficking. So we're proud of at least a small step that will hopefully help in the demand area.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Bridget, for the work that you're doing at AIM. And thank you for the reminder also how other related crimes really fuel this topic of human trafficking, whether it's things like pornography. You know, a lot of times people know that there's offshoots that become really terrible, things like, you know, cyber trafficking, which has become a really major concern globally. So I appreciate you highlighting those. Sandra, you're working at the Global Center for Women and Justice over at Vanguard, and in that context, you've had an opportunity to really you know, look at this issue from a lot of different angles, particularly as it relates to women. But could you highlight some specific programs that you're working on now that you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I believe that our platform is a wonderful gift to our community to educate. And so we offer twice a month the Ending Human Trafficking.org podcast, and those are all free, and they're interviews with people from around the world, with government leaders, with law enforcement, with faith leaders. So endinghumantrafficking.org. We also offer a 12-unit online anti-human trafficking certificate now, and every year we invite everybody to Vanguard's campus where we look at one specific issue at the Ensure Justice Conference. That will happen March 2nd and 3rd, 2018, and our subject is the convergence of substance abuse and human trafficking at Ensure Justice 2018. So come and see us.
That's excellent. And would you give everyone your website address so people can check out the information that you've just shared?
Sure. Vanguard.edu/GCWJ, Global Center for Women and Justice.
Great, thank you. And Don and Bridget, would you also share AIM's website so those that can check out the work that AIM is doing and the ways that they can be involved?
Sure, it's agapewebsite.org.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for being part of this conversation. This is such a difficult topic on many levels, and this amount of time that we've had together certainly only the start of this conversation. We hope that those of you that are in the audience continue this dialogue by joining us in our video recording to review this discussion, as well as following along with our video guide. The video guide will provide you additional resources as well as study questions so that you can dig deeper into this topic of human trafficking. I want to thank our panelists, Bridget Brewster of Agape International Mission, as well as Sandra Morgan, Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice at Vanguard University. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us here for Biblical Justice A to X.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll all join us again next month for our next Biblical Justice A to X series. Thank you. God bless you.